There is a piece of metal in your ear right now, or there was this morning, or there will be on the train home, and it is roughly the size of a shirt button. You have never seen it. You will never see it. It sits sealed inside the stem of a wireless earbud, under a layer of white plastic that was designed specifically so that you would never have a reason to open it. And it is the single component that decides whether the thing works at all. Everything else in that earbud is impressive. The chip is impressive. The microphones are impressive. But none of it does anything without a rechargeable cell smaller than a coin. And for years, the best ones in the world came out of a factory in a small Bavarian town most people outside Germany have never heard of. 350 people work there. On the 24th of July, the company that owns that factory walked into a district court in Stuttgart and filed for insolvency 4 separate times in a single day. Not because the cell stopped working, because the customer stopped calling. Start with the object itself, because almost nobody understands why it is hard, and the difficulty is the whole story. A coin cell is not a small battery in the way that an AA is a small battery. It is a completely different engineering problem wearing a similar shape. When you shrink a lithium-ion cell down to the diameter of a button, everything that was easy at normal size becomes brutal. The ratio of casing to active material goes the wrong way. So you are spending an enormous fraction of your available volume on the shell instead of on the thing that actually holds a charge. Heat has nowhere to go. Manufacturing tolerances that would be perfectly acceptable in a laptop battery become fatal, because a flaw measured in microns is now a meaningful percentage of the total cell. And on top of all that, the customer wants it to survive years of being charged and drained every single day in a sealed plastic tube pressed against a human body at a temperature that swings from a jacket pocket in February to a car dashboard in August. Making a big battery is a chemistry problem. Making a very small one that lasts is a manufacturing problem. And manufacturing problems are won by whoever has spent the most years failing at them. And here's the strange part. The part that makes this whole story feel like it happened behind a curtain. You almost certainly know the name of the company that made those cells. It is on a packet of AA batteries in a kitchen drawer somewhere in your house right now, or it was, or it is in your parents' house. Sitting in that drawer, everybody has where the batteries live next to the takeaway menus and the spare keys. It is a name that reads as ordinary, domestic, slightly boring. The kind of brand you buy without thinking about it for a remote control. What almost nobody outside the industry knew is that the same company, under the same name, was also operating at the absolute technical frontier of miniaturized power. That the boring brand in the drawer and the supplier at the very top of a short list for the world's most demanding electronics buyer were the same firm. That gap between how a company is perceived and what it actually does is not a marketing failure. It is just what happens when the hardest thing you make is a component, because components are invisible by definition. Nobody writes a review of a cell they will never see. Varta had spent a lot of years failing at them. The company traces itself back to the 27th of December, 1887, founded by a man named Adolf Müller, and the name is an acronym in German that translates roughly to the distribution, charging and repair of portable accumulators, which tells you that portable power was the entire point from the first day. The company's own history reads like a list of places batteries are not supposed to work. It says its cells were tested at 50 degrees below zero on a North Pole expedition in 1896. It says its batteries were in the camera on the 1969 moon landing. Take those the way you should take any claim a company makes about its own past. That is the corporate version of the story, told by the corporation. But strip out the romance and the underlying point survives just fine. This was an old, serious, deeply German industrial firm whose entire institutional memory was about squeezing energy into small containers, in an era when almost nobody else considered that a business worth being in. Then the world caught up to them. Wireless earbuds arrived, and suddenly the single hardest component to source in consumer electronics was a tiny rechargeable cell that could survive being sealed inside a product nobody would ever service. Varta had a product line for exactly that. They called it CoinPower, and it became, for a while, one of the most quietly enviable positions in European manufacturing, because when the biggest consumer electronics company on earth needed something that only a handful of firms in the world could make, the shortlist was short, and Varta was on it. Here's where I want you to stop enjoying the story for a second, because this is the exact moment where the trap opens. And it opens while everything looks like it is going right. Winning a contract like that does not just bring revenue, it brings a shape. You start building capacity for one buyer's volume forecast. Your production line gets tuned to one buyer's specification. You hire against one buyer's roadmap. You finance against one buyer's order book. And your engineering priorities quietly become that buyer's engineering priorities. From the outside, it reads as success. And honestly, on the accounting statements, for a while, it is success. But look at the actual structure of what you have built. That stopped being a customer relationship a while ago. What you have now is a dependency with a purchase order stapled to the front of it. The thing that makes it so dangerous is that it feels like the opposite of risk. It feels like you have arrived. And the arithmetic underneath is unforgiving in a way that people outside manufacturing consistently underestimate. When a supplier builds a dedicated line for one product, the machines are not general purpose. The tooling is not general purpose. That capital is sunk into a very specific shape, and it can only be recovered by running that specific shape at volume for years. Which means the supplier is not just exposed to losing the customer. The supplier is exposed to losing the customer at any moment during a repayment window that lasts longer than most contracts do. The buyer, meanwhile, carries almost none of that. A second source can be qualified inside a year, run in parallel, and the decision made later, calmly, with no pressure at all. None of this is a scandal. It is just the ordinary, unglamorous, extremely one-sided physics of being the small end of a big supply chain. And it applies to thousands of firms you have never heard of in dozens of industries right now. And there is a second layer to this that makes the trap tighter than it first appears, which is the qualification process. Before a large manufacturer will put your component into a product it sells by the tens of millions, it puts that component through an approval process that is genuinely grueling. Testing, auditing your factory floor, validating your process controls, running the part through abuse cycles that simulate years of use, checking that you can hold your tolerances not once but across every batch, indefinitely. That process is slow and it is expensive and both sides pay for it. And here's the psychological trick buried inside it. Because qualification is so hard, being qualified feels permanent. You have been through the gauntlet, they have signed off on your line. It genuinely does feel like a door that is closed behind you in a good way. But qualification is not a promise about the future. It is a snapshot of the present. It certifies that you can make the part. It says nothing at all about who else the buyer might be quietly putting through the same gauntlet at the same time, in a different country, on a different cost base. And large buyers almost always are, because carrying a single source of anything critical is exactly the kind of risk their own procurement departments exist to eliminate. The very concentration that feels like security to the supplier reads, on the buyer's side of the table, as an unacceptable vulnerability to be engineered away. Two organizations looking at the identical relationship, and one of them experiences it as a fortress while the other experiences it as a problem to be solved. Now, most people who have heard anything about this story think it starts in 2026. It does not. It starts 2 years earlier, and the first collapse is the part almost everyone has forgotten, even though it was, by almost any measure, the more brutal of the two. In July of 2024, Varta entered a restructuring procedure under a German law called StaRUG, a relatively modern framework designed to let a company reorganize its debts without going through a full insolvency. What came out the other side was not a gentle reorganization. The company's share capital was reduced to zero. That phrase is doing something violent in the vocabulary of a filing cabinet. Reduced to zero means the existing shareholders, every fund, every pension allocation, every ordinary saver who had bought into a 130-year-old battery maker because it sounded like a safe piece of European industry, walked out with nothing. Not reduced, not diluted, nothing. And the group lost its stock market listing on the way out the door. The debt pile was cut from 485 million euros down to 200 million. 60 million euros of fresh equity went in, alongside another 60 million in a senior secured loan. And the money came from two places: Porsche, the sports car manufacturer, and a company controlled by an Austrian entrepreneur named Michael Tojner. When the dust settled, those two owned the whole thing, 50% each. Varta came out of the procedure with fresh capital in April of 2025 and, on paper, a future. So hold both halves of that in your head, because the second half of this story does not make sense without it. By the spring of 2026, Varta was a company that had already been through the fire once. It had already wiped out its public shareholders. Its listing on the stock exchange was already gone. It had already been recapitalized by two owners who had chosen deliberately, with full visibility into the books, to put 120 million euros into it. And it still had the Apple contract. Then, in the spring, Apple made a decision about the next generation of AirPods cells and moved that production to Chinese manufacturers. I want to be very careful here, because this is the point where a story like this usually turns into something dishonest. The reporting on why is not mysterious, and it is not sinister. Varta could not match the cost being offered out of China for the next generation of cells. That is the stated reason, and the underlying reason behind the stated reason is not a secret either. Manufacturing batteries in Germany carries higher labor costs, higher energy costs, and higher operating costs than manufacturing them in most Asian production centers. That is not an accusation. It is an input price. Energy, in particular, is not a small line item when your product is literally made by pushing electricity into material in a temperature-controlled room for hours. A German industrial firm and a Chinese one can run the identical process, at the identical quality, and arrive at different numbers at the bottom. Because the electricity going into the room costs something different. Apple did not break a contract, as far as any of the reporting shows. Apple ran a sourcing decision, the way every large manufacturer on Earth runs sourcing decisions, and picked the cheaper, qualified supplier. If you have ever chosen the less expensive of two functionally identical things, you have made the same decision, just with 3 fewer zeros attached. But look at what that ordinary, defensible, completely legal decision landed on. The plant in Nördlingen, in Bavaria, where those cells are made and where 350 people work, is scheduled to close in October. And on the 24th of July, 2026, Varta filed 4 insolvency applications at the district court in Stuttgart, confirmed by a spokesperson for the court itself. 4, not 1. That detail matters more than it looks, because a modern industrial group is not a single legal entity. It is a stack of them, and filings land on the specific companies that can no longer meet their obligations. Which is also why the household battery business, the one whose name you actually recognize, the one on the packet of AA cells in a supermarket in Hamburg or Vienna, is not inside all of those applications. Creditors, including Deutsche Bank, are reported to be looking at acquiring that household battery business. Tojner is reported to be looking at the micro battery division, which is a polite procedural way of describing something fairly stark. The company is being taken apart, and the parts that still work are being sorted from the parts that do not. And now the detail that I think is the actual center of this whole story, the one that reframes everything that came before it. Losing Apple did not by itself put Varta in that courtroom. What put Varta in that courtroom was that when the money ran short, Porsche and Michael Tojner, the two owners, the two entities that had already committed 120 million euros 2 years earlier, the two parties with the most complete possible information about the business, declined to put in more. Sit with that for a second. They were not distant institutional shareholders reading a summary. These were the owners, with 120 million euros already committed, and a restructuring they had watched work from the inside. And they looked at a company that had just lost the customer the whole thesis was built on, and they made the coldest and most rational call available to them, which was to stop. That is the difference between a customer and an owner, and it is the difference this entire story exists to illustrate. A customer can leave. That is what customers do. It is priced in. Everyone understands the deal. An owner is supposed to be the floor underneath the company, the thing that catches it when the customer leaves. And the specific unlucky arithmetic of what happened here is that Varta lost both, in sequence, within a few months. First, the buyer walked. Then the floor did. The German press has been careful about this, and it is worth borrowing their care. The reporting attributes what happened to Apple and to the general business condition of the company, not to Apple alone. A firm that had to zero out its shareholders and leave the stock exchange in 2024 was not a healthy firm that got ambushed in 2026. It was a firm with a very thin margin for error, running on borrowed time and borrowed money, for which one very large customer was the entire remaining case for continuing. When that case went away, the people holding the equity did the maths again and got a different answer than they got the first time. It would be very easy to end here with a villain, and I understand the appeal, because that ending is more satisfying and it travels further. But I do not think it is true, and the true version is more useful to you anyway. Nobody in this story did anything illegal. Nobody has been charged with anything. Apple bought a component from whoever could make it at the price it wanted, which is what buyers do. Porsche and Tojner declined to send more money after 120 million euros had already gone in, which is what owners are entitled to do. A German factory could not match a Chinese cost structure, which is not a moral failing on anyone's part. It is an electricity bill and a wage bill that simply come out at different numbers on different continents. Every single actor here behaved reasonably, and the outcome was still 350 people in a Bavarian town with an October date on a calendar. Which is why the lesson worth carrying out of this has almost nothing to do with batteries and very little to do with Apple. The lesson is that excellence is not a moat. Varta was genuinely, technically, world-class at the thing it did. Being the best at making a component did not protect it, because the value it created was real, but the position it occupied was not defensible. It could be replicated by someone with a lower energy bill. And the moment it was replicated, everything that made the company special, the century of accumulated know-how, the tolerances, the institutional memory of squeezing power into small spaces, became, from the buyer's side of the table, a line item that had a cheaper equivalent. You will see this shape again once you know to look for it. The precision supplier who is world-leading and has one buyer. A brilliant contractor whose entire book is one government agency. The freelancer at the very top of their craft with one client who covers 80% of the invoices. In every one of those, the quality is real and the fragility is real, and the fragility is not a function of the quality. It sits underneath it, completely independent of it, waiting for one procurement meeting in a building you have never been inside. If you keep one figure from all of this, do not keep the 485 million in debt, and do not keep the 120 million that went in and never came back out. Keep a much smaller one. One customer for the product line that mattered most. A company that survived 2 world wars, that put its cells at 50 below zero in 1896 and by its own account on a camera pointed at the surface of the moon, was undone in the end by a supplier list with a single name at the top of it, and by the discovery that the 2 owners who had caught it once had no obligation to catch it twice. The earbud in your ear still works, by the way. It will keep working. The cell inside it will be made somewhere else by someone else, at a price nobody outside a procurement department will ever see. That is the part that unsettles me most about this one. From where you are sitting, absolutely nothing changed. The product is identical. The price is identical. Every visible surface of the thing is exactly as it was. All that happened is that the floor moved quietly 4,500 miles away, and the only people who felt it were the 350 who were standing on it. So tell me, what is the most fragile-looking thing you rely on that you have never once thought about? Put it in the comments. I read them. And if you want more stories about the invisible plumbing underneath the products you use every day, the like button helps more than you would think. And subscribing means the next one finds you.